documentary, Lady Wrestler, The Amazing Untold Story of African American Women in the Ring, debuts on Amazon Prime Video on February 16, 2021, during Black History Month. Lady Wrestler tells the story of courageous black women who broke racial and gender boundaries in pro wrestling in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I'm Chris Bournet, and I wrote, directed, produced, and narrated the documentary. It was a true labor of love. I was born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, which became the epicenter of the golden age of women's wrestling in the 1930s through the 1950s. And even though I'm a native of the city that gave birth to professional women's wrestling, I didn't find out about this story until I was an adult and became a journalist. So why has this story been underground, locked away for so many decades? Why are these trailblazing African American women hidden figures of wrestling, as they were dubbed in an article by Associated Press reporter Andrew Welsh Huggins in an article that ran in the Washington Post in 2018? An interview with the daughter of one unsung wrestling legend offers insight. In this interview, Valerie Hawes sheds light on why her mother, the late Lula Mae Provo, erased her history as a wrestler after retiring from the industry.
She didn't tell people what her job was. She didn't like it when her friends or, relatives would share what she did for a living. It was just not something that they talked about.
That's coming up on Lady Wrestler, the story behind the story. I don't think we've ever really sat and had an in-depth conversation, about your mom and about your experience growing up. Right. So I first wanted to ask you, so growing up, how much did you know about your mother, about her wrestling career? Is it something she talked about? Is it something you were aware of, or?
I was obviously aware that she did it, right? And talked to me about it a little. But she would get so angry if myself or my dad or any of our relatives was shared with other people.
Okay.
Even in this, even in like the 80s, she didn't want to talk about it, even though she hadn't done it in 20 years, prior to that. But in the 80s, she still didn't want people to know. Like, I don't know if there was just some shame around it. My guess is that the industry was shameful to her.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Just like, I guess for some, entertainment in general during certain time periods, that wasn't considered a legitimate job or a respectable profession. So she didn't like me telling a lot of people about it.
Okay.
As I got a little older, though, maybe in the 90s, she would share a little bit more, but she wanted to be the one to share it. She would pick and choose who she'd talk about it to. But she talked to me about some of her experiences. Yeah.
Did she ever, break out memorabilia or show you old photos, or was it more just kind of when she was in the mood, she would kind of start talking about some of her experiences? She
didn't really have any memorabilia.
Okay.
She had a couple of pictures that were like the one picture that you have with her standing.
Yes.
Probably the same time that photo shoot was done. There's another picture I have that I can't even find it because I was looking for it just recently, but it's the same swimsuit or what have you. And she's like in a windowsill and she posed in a windowsill with it on. And I think one other one. But it wasn't until we were watching Tavis Smiley. Tavis Smiley had his first talk show on BET.
Yes.
And we were just watching. We would watch it all the time. And we were sitting there one night watching it, and he was interviewing someone who had written a book called the Stars of the Wrestling Industry.
Was it a Black author?
It was a Black author.
Yeah, because
Black people in it, though, right? It was.
Well, the one book that I know of is called Superstars Superstars of Wrestling by Julian Shabazz.
Yes, that's it. Because I bought it.
I did too. Yeah.
Okay. And we were sitting there watching it. I remember I'm doing something, she's doing something else, but it's on, and they start talking about wrestling, and she looked up and she was like, "Oh, that's interesting." And I think they flashed her picture real fast.
Yes.
She said, "That's Ethel." And I said, "Who's Ethel, Mom?" She was like, "My partner." I was like, "Really? That's her?" She's like, "Yeah." So as soon as I saw that, I ordered the book.
Okay.
And so we had that book, and that's the only time we had any information. And I want to say towards the back of the book, there was memorabilia that was shared within it, right? Of some events, and my mom's picture is in there, and a couple of other pictures in there of her. So that's the only time we had anything where I got to see her, posters and stuff like that.
So when she'd share experiences, what did she talk about? Were they positive experiences or negative experiences or both? Or, if you feel comfortable sharing.
Yeah, no, there's nothing I couldn't share with you. I would say the positive things she would say on the surface were, they were all real sharp women.
Mm-hmm.
Their style was, their whole shtick was, they were beautiful, they were sharply dressed at all times from head to toe. They looked like models, but they whooped ass. That was the whole thing, right? So they didn't look like wrestlers, but they were wrestlers, and so that was a positive. My mom would tell me the way she was recruited was she was working at, was it called the Miramore? That used to open here off of Mount Vernon. It was like a night supper club or something.
Mm-hmm.
It was a coat check girl. And Billy used to come in there to see jazz or hear jazz and enjoy himself there. And he would see her and thought she was really pretty, and thought she was very professional in the way that she carried herself. And so after 2 or 3 times, he said, "I think I want you to come work for me."
Wow.
And she didn't know what he did at the time. And then as time went on, she learned more about what he did. I guess he somehow talked her into it. I don't know much more than that, but that was sort of how that happened.
Right. So what in your, from what you recall, did she ever talk about any of the challenges of being a Black woman in the wrestling industry?
Yeah, I mean, she talked about not necessarily the industry.
Mm-hmm.
Talked about to me was the instances where when they would have to travel to different events, especially if they had to travel from here to the South and they'd have to pass through. She said that there would be times when there'd be Billy and the ladies all in the car traveling together. But when they get to certain places, they would have to switch seats, like sometimes he'd be sitting up front or sometimes he'd be driving and they would all be in seats. But when they get to certain states, they would switch where one of them would have to drive, he'd have to get in the back seat, and they may have to, a couple of them have to duck down, that kind of. She would talk about that. She would talk about having to enter, one where they couldn't stay at some of the same hotels as some of the, the white wrestlers would stay. They would have to stay at the same hotels that the Black entertainers in the Chitlin circuit would have to stay at. She would talk to me about quite often too, if they weren't driving in a car with Billy, then they would often travel with the Globetrotters. They would share a bus and travel together. So she said there were a lot of entertainers and they were considered entertainers too. So they would all travel together, stay at the same places. They were all good friends, and she would just talk about it that way. And she would also speak about how in many of the events or venues that they would perform at, that they would always have to enter through the back or go through the kitchen and all of those things. So she talked a lot about that.
Did she ever say anything like, well, I really enjoyed this particular experience, or I enjoyed getting to travel and see such and such a place? Or was it all kind of the struggle of it, or did she ever talk about the glamour aspect of it?
She never spoke of it as glamour.
Okay.
So, I mean, she said that, you know, her friends who knew what she did, you know, they would always, and even to this day, like my aunts and uncles that, you know, who weren't my blood necessarily aunts and uncles, but people who were considered my family would always talk about how sharp she was, that she was the sharpest dressed person they ever knew, that she always looked like $1,000,000. And she would talk about enjoying traveling to different places and seeing the country. And she probably would not have seen the country had it not been for that experience. She, you know, she ate well, she dressed well, she traveled well, but outside of that, it was still just a job to her.
Okay.
She was impressed by it. And if she was home, she didn't tell people what her job was. She didn't like it when her friends or, you know, relatives would share what she did for a living. It was just not something that they talked about or that they wanted to talk about. I would say one of the most negative things, though, that she's told me about was on 2 different occasions when they were traveling. They stayed in one hotel and she talked about, you know, being robbed a couple of times. One time being robbed, and she knew it had to be like an inside job, somebody who knew and saw them come in, knew how they were obviously dressed and all the things they were bringing, and just assumed they had money and that sort of thing. But one other time when she was actually sleeping and someone entered her hotel room, and she said, in this particular experience, I know in particular, she said, my mother's mother passed away when she was 8 years old. So she was asleep in the hotel, and in the middle of the night, she said her mother just came to her in her dream, but not in a loving way, came to her and like in a way that it scared her. And she felt like her mother was waking her up, startled her on purpose and woke her up out of her sleep. And when she jumped up, she startled the man in the hotel room.
Mm.
And my mom used to, you know, even when she died, she was like this. She would keep a knife nearby, a gun, some kind of weapon nearby. So especially when she traveled, she would have a weapon in the bed with her, that kind of thing. And my mother was always a fighter anyway. Like even as a little girl, when my mother's mother passed away, she got bounced around to a lot of different relatives, had to keep her, you know. She was separated from her siblings. She was the one sibling who had a different father than her others, her 3 siblings. And their father came and got the 3 of them. And her father was off at the war. So she got bounced around a lot. So she always was about protecting her space, protecting her body, and taking care of herself. And she had to fight constantly to take care of herself. And so going into the wrestling world was kind of like a natural, you know, she was a natural fighter, if you will. So she just always was mindful about security and just keeping things, staying safe. So she always had a weapon in the bed with her when she traveled. And so when she woke up, saw the person, she goes to grab the weapon and she scares him and runs the man out the room. But she said she felt as if her mother hadn't wakened her up that night, that she might have been raped or anything could have happened, killed, who knows, you know.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what was your perception of wrestling, knowing that your mom had been a wrestler? Was it sort of just something like, okay, well, that was something she did long ago and she doesn't like to talk about that much? Is it something that made you think, okay, I'm a girl, but I can be involved in sports? Did you ever consider, becoming a wrestler yourself? Or was it just
No.
something distant and not really a part of your day-to-day life?
No, not at all. What I will tell you is this. When I was a little girl, I love wrestling, like watching, like, Tony Atlas and, those guys. I used to watch it all the time. And my mother despised the sport. She despised wrestling. And so when it would come on, she'd be like, turn that mess off. My dad and I would watch it. I was always a girly girl, but I don't know why I was still like watching wrestling. Now, my mother loved boxing, and she could coach someone. She had coached guys to box. So she loved boxing, but she hated wrestling. So when wrestling would come on or they came to town, my dad and I would go with my cousins, and she'd be like, I hate this mess. And she would always say, that mess is fake. And I said, it's not fake, Mom. I'm looking at it. It's not fake. And she's like, Val, it's fake. It's fake. It's not real. And I'm like, why are you saying it's fake? I'm looking at them. So she would, as time went on, she would explain more and more about how they choreographed a lot of the matches, and how, walking into a fight, she said, look, you can't fake the hits and the falls, but of course you got to practice and know how to fall and know how to take a hit. And she said, we always knew who was going to win in the end, but we still fought throughout the thing. And, so she talked about that and would explain to me, they already know who's going to win. I'm like, no, they don't, So, that she hated it, though. She hated that sport. She hated it.
Do you think the hate was just simply because she knew it was choreographed, or was it because partly the experiences she had, the negative experiences she had as a wrestler, or a little of both? Or
I would bet it's both. I would bet it's more of the fact that it was fake, but I think it was probably both. The fact that it was fake, the fact that even though she may have had a good living, made a good living while she was there, she knew that she wasn't getting paid the same as the men, and she wasn't getting paid the same as the white people. So I think there was this, she didn't like that. Yeah, and I also think, this could just be me. I don't know for sure if this was the case, but I think my mom stopped wrestling not because she wanted to, she had to. When I had an older sister, my sister was 11 years older than me. I lost my sister about 5 years ago.
Sorry.
And no, that's not, yeah, 4 years ago. And when my mother stopped wrestling because she was home taking care of my sister, and she cut her hand some kind of way. I think she was doing something at home. She cut her hand, and it never came back in a way where she felt comfortable. And so I don't know if it was really her choice to quit when she did. I think she would have probably continued it at least for a little longer. I don't know that she would have done it for a lot longer, but I don't think it ended the way she would have planned. So there may have been some resentment about it, about that, I'm not really sure. But I know she hated the sport.
Wow. So tell us about her life after the ring. What did she do after she left wrestling?
When she left wrestling, she went to work with, when she left wrestling, she lived in DC for a little while. She worked at a drugstore, I think, for a couple of years as a manager of a drugstore in DC. And that's where she reconnected with my dad. She had met my dad when they were like 14 and 15. And then he left and went to the service at 16. She eventually she started working and eventually wrestling, met a man, had a baby. And then she went to DC and was working, and then connected with my father. They just happened to bump into each other in DC, and moved back to Columbus. And when they moved back to Columbus, she went to work for Buckeye Youth Center, which is how she knows Uncle Tim. So, and she became a youth leader, and she retired from there. Now, wrestling, let me just say this, her wrestling And her fighting spirit is what allowed her to be good at her job at Buckeye Youth Center. Because those guys used to talk about, like Uncle Tim and a couple of the other guys that worked with her would always talk about how there would be times when, because she worked with the boys, and she preferred to work with the boys, because she said when she worked with girls for 1 year, and she said she felt like every day she was fighting. She had, the girls wanted to fight her all the time. But when she went to work with the boys, they had a little more respect. But there would always be a guy that would try her, and they would talk about how sometimes the guy might get smart with her, the young boys would get smart with her and act like they want to challenge her. And she would be like, you know what, we need to go in here and have a talk. And they'd go behind closed doors. And then they'd hear bam, 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 room or something. And they'd come out the room and the boy would be like, yes, Miss Hawes. Yes, Miss Hawes. It would be a whole different situation. And so people knew not to mess with her. Like she'd fight a boy in a minute. So it's just her nature, and they all respected her.
So tell us about your journey in trying to tell her story. Where are you with that?
Still thinking about it.
Okay.
Trying to figure out how I would do it. It's funny because I've even thought about, because while wrestling is a part of her story, it's not her whole story. Like, I feel like my mom, all her life, she's had to be a fighter. So one of the things one of the titles that come to mind when I think about writing her story is, To Wrestle with Love is like a description of her life, from the time she was a child until her death. She was always debating, or she was always having to stand up for herself, or she was fighting for rights. She was fighting for this. She was fighting for that. So, the wrestling piece of it, it makes sense that she would have had that as a part of her journey. But I felt like everything about her life was about wrestling with being accepted, or wrestling towards, being respected, being loved the way she felt she deserved to be loved, all of those things. So I'm still thinking on it. I haven't written a thing, but thinking on it.
Right. So what would you like people to know about your mom, other than the fact that she was a wrestler? You mentioned she, was really good with working with the youth at the Buckeye Youth Center. But what are some things about her that you think maybe wrestling fans, because, I still get wrestling fans contacting me saying, oh, can you tell me about, Ethel? Can you tell me about Ramona? What are some things you think that her fans would be interested to know about her that maybe they didn't know back then?
That my mom had I want to say a 6th grade education at the most. For the most part, she hid that. She didn't tell people because she couldn't have had her job later in life. She couldn't have had the job she had if they knew she didn't have a high school diploma. So she lied about that. But she was probably one of the smartest people I've ever known. She was, she read everything she could get her hands on. She loved politics. She was just very smart. She was very much a caregiver. And she had a passion for young people, but boys in particular. She was the mother of 2 girls, but she was passionate about boys. And I don't think that people, the other thing is she had a lot of class and a lot of style. And so I don't think that that's what comes to mind. Any of those things I just named, I don't think that's what necessarily comes to mind when you think of someone who would be a wrestler. But she knew how to dress. She taught me to be a lady. She would have died if I ever came in there and said, you know what I want to be a wrestler. She would have lost her ever loving mind. So she wanted the best for her kids and for my son, her grandchild. She wanted us to be educated. She wanted us to love reading. She wanted us to know about our community and politics. All of those things. Like wrestling, I think that's why, because she probably, and I'm just thinking, But I would bet one of the reasons why she didn't want people to think of her as a wrestler is because she felt like that's just something she did to make a living, but that's certainly not who she was. You know what I'm saying? So I think that understanding just how smart she was, and see, Ramona would probably be one that would really be able to speak to that too. I want to say Ramona at one point worked at Tico too, or something, didn't she?
I'm
And
not sure about that, but I know Marva did.
Marva did? Okay.
Uh-huh.
Oh, I do remember hearing that. Okay. Yeah. Oh, you had that in the documentary though.
Right. Uh-huh.
I think that was the first time I heard that, but I think that anybody who knew her, they would never think if she definitely probably wouldn't have necessarily told people that she was a wrestler at some point. They would have known her to be more of like an advocate or activist, or I don't think they would say she was smart. They would say she liked to argue, but they wouldn't see her as a wrestler per se, you know? And I think that that's what she would rather be known for, being smart and being well-read and for working hard, and that she was a hard worker, you know? And even with wrestling, she would have been a hard worker at that. You know, she would have gone hard in the ring. She would have wanted to be in good shape and would have been working out all during the day, you know, just to make sure that she was ready for whatever. My mother was always about being prepared. So I think that's what she would want people to know. So therefore, that's what I would want them to know about her.
When you watch wrestling now, are you able to enjoy it, or does it still your mom's words of how it's fake and how it's choreographed? Does that kind of spoil it for you?
Oh, totally, Leah. I don't watch it. I don't watch it. I mean, by the time I got to high school, I wasn't even thinking about it anymore. I literally was in middle school, like really a fanatic about it. But by the time I got to high school, and after her being in my ear about it and going on and on about how fake it was, I was like, oh, okay, well, all right, never mind then, you know? But yeah, no, I don't watch it.
Yeah, the analogy I always draw though is, I mean, my experience with wrestling was similar to yours, where I was really into it when I was like in middle school, and I was really into Roddy Piper and all those the guys that were in the WWF before it was the WWE, and
Exactly.
then I sort of outgrew it.
Yeah.
But the analogy I always make when people criticize wrestling for being fake is I say, well, would you criticize a ballerina for doing a choreographed dance? You know, does hard work and discipline not go into being a dancer? And that's how I look at it as. And I know people view sports as sports should be pure and sports should be a pure competition, but do you have an appreciation for you talked about how much of a hard worker she was and how prepared she was. I mean, that really takes a lot of preparation, a lot of, like you said, knowing how to fall and knowing how to do those moves, even if you're just doing it for entertainment, to entertain the audience. It still takes skill, I think.
For sure. I wouldn't argue with that at all. I mean, she made a good point to share how hard they worked to ensure that, look, if they weren't prepared and they didn't know how to fall, they could truly kill themselves, you know, or get killed in that ring or leave paralyzed. So yes, for sure. It's definitely about knowing how to do the things that they do and knowing how to do it well to be successful at it, for sure. So yeah, I have respect for the athleticism that goes into it, but you know, I don't watch it.
Yeah. And I think one thing that Ethel told me during our interview was that she said she felt like modern wrestling had lost even the athletic part of it. It was all about just having muscles just for show and just, all about the flash and all about the whatever is going to make as many people buy tickets or tune in. She felt like it had just become totally show business and the athletic part of it had totally been lost. So she said that's why she didn't like watching it anymore. So I think a lot of the wrestlers like of your mom and her generation, they truly learned, the sex, muscles, and diamonds formula of Billy Wolf and they would look at it in their later years and just say it's nothing like, the training that they had, the discipline it took to be a real athlete. Yeah. So why do you think this history of these women like your mom, why has this history been lost? Is it just simply the women didn't want to talk about it and they have moved on to other parts of their life? It seems like it's slowly starting to be resurrected, and the WWE is starting to recognize some of the original women like your mother. Why do you think, even in Columbus, I mean, I feel like women like your mother should be on the Longstreet Bridge. They have everybody else on that bridge. I mean, why do you think it's so underground?
I think it's underground because because they kept it underground even then, that the women that were a part of it probably, I mean, I can't speak for the other women, but I know how my mother did not want people to know. So if she didn't want anyone to know, she's certainly not outright sharing her story so that it could be well known, so that it could be passed on, so that it could be documented properly. Because I don't think people realize that this was such a wrestling mecca as it was at that time, So because of that, I think that's why it's lost. Now, I don't think it's because anybody would purposefully disregard them, but I think they just didn't want to be noticed in that way. I think that's what it is. And I don't know if you remember this, but years ago, and it was right before you did the article in the Dispatch.
Okay.
Eric Carmichael. See, Eric was a good friend of mine, and he knew that my mom was a wrestler. See, by that time, my mother was talking about it a little more. I had shared it with Eric. And by the time I shared it with Eric, he had come over to my place. I was having a gathering at my home. And he came over and he saw my mom there. And he said, so Val tells me you used to be a wrestler. She said, Val, I told you to stop telling people. But she said that she did all that for a second. But before we knew it, for about an hour and a half, she went and just started telling us all these stories. And it was just, the place, you could have heard a pin drop. And there was like 25, 30 people just sitting there quiet, sitting around there. And you'd have thought Eric was Don Lemon or somebody, the way he was interviewing her and asking the questions. And we were sitting, hell, I was learning stuff myself that night. She really got into it. She shared the stories and she was just talking about the times and talked about, the discrimination and the things of that nature that they encountered. But it was interesting. And so after that, I remember he called me not too long after that and said, hey, I've got this friend who's writing this article. And he said, ask your mom if she'll meet with him. And mommy was like, no, I'm not talking about it. And plus, it shouldn't be me. It should be Ethel or Babs. He should talk to them. And I was like, but mom, you were there too. You did it too. No, I'm not talking about it. I was like, what the heck? What is this about? I didn't understand it because I felt like she should have been more proud of her own accomplishments. But she literally, she really and truly respected and appreciated Babs and Ethel and Marva. And she's like, they're the real stars. And, they taught me how to do it, so Billy, recruited her. Yes. But they took her under their wing and showed her. That's how she got her training. They trained her. And so she felt like it's not my story to tell. It should be them who tells the story. That's how she felt.
Wow. And it's so cool that Babs and Ethel were mentors to other women rather than saying, I don't want anybody to rise to my level or being, competitive and trying to keep the newcomer like your mom out of the spotlight. They actually took the time to mentor her like that. That's really cool.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It was the four of them all the time that traveled together for the most part. And then I guess when mommy stepped aside, Ramona came in. And worked with the three of them. So they became the foursome. So, And oftentimes she would tell me too how it was interesting how a lot of people didn't know that the three of them were sisters. And so here these sisters are fighting their sister and mommy, you know, and that sort of thing, you know. She talked about that a lot too, how we would pretend like we didn't know each other, how we hated each other. And here we are, we then drove in the car to the event together to the venue. So I thought that was funny.
Yeah, you know, one thing I've noticed about wrestling, and I don't know if you've noticed this too, and I've talked about this before, is that it seems like wrestling is one of those sports where men are willing to watch women, women wrestlers, you know, and I always say I can't imagine a football game where all the players are on the field are women and men are in the stands cheering them on. But that just seems something that's unique about wrestling. In fact, most of the people that contact me about the documentary and, oh, when can I see it, are men. I mean, every now and then I'll get a woman that's interested in it, but it's interesting to me that wrestling is considered a man's sport, but men are able to kind of drop that macho thing and be able to appreciate women like your mother and Ethel and Babs. And I just don't see that another, even, you know, the WNBA is not even, you know, to the level of where male fans are so passionate the way male wrestling fans are. It's sort of like if you can wrestle, they don't really care what gender you are. Yeah. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, that is true. That is true. You know what? Something came to mind that I will say that this was the only time when I would hear her really spend time talking about their technique and how, or speak of what she did in a respectable way, was when there would be times, see, growing up, when there was the Tony Atlas and the, you know, Randy Savage and all those guys, I didn't see women wrestlers, and maybe there were a couple, but I definitely didn't see Black ones or anything, but I don't remember the women, if there were any. I only saw the men. The only time I would see women at that time, at my age, you know, at that young age, were women who were doing mud wrestling, right? And she was livid about some foolishness like that. She thought that was just ridiculous. It was absurd. It was just demeaning. It was, you know, she had no respect for that. So that's when she would definitely start talking about the work that went into what they did. And then she'd really go into it, right? But she hated mud wrestling. So in my mind, as a young kid, the only time I saw it was, you know, men cheering on women in doing that foolishness. You know what I'm saying? But other than that, I never thought about it until as I got older, you know, and started to hear her talk a little bit more, and her talk about her relationships with some of the male wrestlers, in particular, like Bobo Brazil. And like, I guess he was friends with them. And she named other people that I obviously wouldn't know. But like when I got that book that you and I were just talking about, she went through several of those pages. She knew a lot of those people, Black and white. You know, she knew them. And I guess there were white wrestlers too that would come and watch them or knew of them. And she felt like a lot of them stole their style and a lot of that from them. But yeah.
It's just interesting that a lot of Black, you know, musical performers, they had their style and their music stolen by people like Elvis and Pat Boone, and would take it and do the pop version of it and make more money at it. And it's the same thing happened with the Black wrestlers, it sounded like. Yeah, that's interesting. So what do you think can be done to have this history preserved rather than just have it disappear? You know, I'm trying a little bit with the documentary, but what, you know, like I said, I think, you know, women like your mother, like Ethel and Babs, should be on that Longstreet Bridge. I just think there needs to be more of a push to commemorate these women.
I think also getting some sort of endorsement from somebody who's already a well-known, established athlete or even entertainer who would know something about the history, or who has a passion for the sport, or who also that we could educate on it and enlighten them and get them to be the advocate for it, because I think that's probably the easier way to get it done.
Next time on Lady Wrestler, the story behind the story. Why is women's wrestling one of the few, if not the only, sports in which women are the athletes and men make up a significant portion, if not the majority, of the fan base? We'll hear from John Orlando, host of the PVD Cast podcast about wrestling and all things pop culture.
There was another different appeal for some men watching women's wrestling, and that was that, it was unique, it was different.
Filmmaker and longtime wrestling supporter Antonio Hernandez.
Because I was already kind of exposed through other things, seeing women like be strong, be performers, so it wasn't super mind-blowing. It was kind of just like, oh, that's just what she is.
And Nick Alexander, co-host of the 10 Bell Pod Wrestling Podcast.
Like, are you telling me a good story that's going to make me care about this match? And once you're in the ring, are you continuing to tell a great story? Are you performing in a way that's exciting?
Join us for the next edition of Lady Wrestler, the story behind the story.